Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. I come to you today with a new tag created by Rick McDonnell, the In or Out tag. The prompts he's come up with offer us a chance to state fairly briefly where we stand on various bookish subjects, both popular tropes as well as personal behaviors. I should probably warn you first that whenever people ask me yes or no questions, my answers are very frequently, it depends. So we'll see how this goes. Let's get started. In or out? Prompt number 1, reading the last page first. Well, here I can be definitive, I think. I don't read the last page first, and don't really understand why someone would. If a reader wants to know how a plot wraps up, the last page very often doesn't really provide that answer. The last page typically acquires its meaning over the course of the book, and usually doesn't really resonate until you have already gotten to know the characters and the basic plot line. So at least for me, I'm not making a huge effort to avoid that last page, but I see no reason to actively seek it out either. There's one slight exception. In nonfiction works with endnotes, I like to put a second bookmark at the point between the end of the text and the beginning of the notes section. That does mean that sometimes I see that last page of text, although without the intention of reading it. Next, enemies to lovers, in or out? True enemies to lovers would be out for me. But I enjoy pre-romantic sparring between equally strong and spunky characters. Jane Eyre and Mr. Rochester are not enemies, but the tension between them is clearly not just positive sexual tension. I suppose Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy are almost enemies, and I find their shift into lovers to be both charmingly sweet and quite funny. So, sharp people who have to struggle a bit to turn from proud individuals into a couple, I think that would be an in. Prompt 3. Are dream sequences in or out? The stories I wrote as a child often started out with wildly creative premises, and then when I was too overwhelmed to figure out how to write my way out of those situations, miraculously the main character would wake up to realize that the whole plot had just been a dream sequence. Now that I've stopped even trying to write fiction, I have totally given up on dream sequences, and they're out in my reading experience as well. Number 4, love triangles. I'm rather fond of love triangles when done in a less than obvious way. When love triangle just means two different people who are both in love with the same third person, I don't find it especially interesting as a trope. But sometimes it can be more complex. One of my favorite writers of complicated love triangles is Carson McCullers. In her novella, The Ballad of the Sad Cafe, she tells the story of the womanizing criminal, Marvin Macy, the wealthy and lonely Miss Amelia, and the deformed hunchback, Cousin Lyman. Marvin Macy loved Miss Amelia, but she didn't love him. Instead, Miss Amelia loved Cousin Lyman, but he didn't love her, and Lyman loved Marvin, who of course did not love him. Perhaps my favorite McCullers love triangle isn't a tri-directional love story, but instead a situation where one person loves two others, instead of two people loving the one. The Member of the Wedding is about Frankie Adams, a 12-year-old white tomboy living in the South. Her mother died when she was young, and her father is emotionally distant. Instead, the people she feels closest to are the black maid/nanny who takes care of her and her 6-year-old cousin. Aside from her awkward relationship with the two of them, she feels isolated and friendless, and she's sure she doesn't fit in. She has a much older brother, and when he announces his wedding, Frankie hopes to escape her loneliness by joining him and his bride on their honeymoon. She plans to marry the two of them, although of course her feelings are not reciprocated. The story is heartbreaking, and also a story that might be especially interesting to read right now during Pride Month, since McCullers talks openly about concepts of gender fluidity, as well as certain kinds of fluidity along the lines of age and race and sexuality. Okay, the next prompt is cracked spines, in or out. I'm a big believer in writing in my books, which for the last few decades I've tried to do fairly lightly in pencil without massive cracks in the spines. When I was younger, I often deliberately cracked the spines of long books in particular places just to make the book stay open more easily. I avoid that now and even try to purchase specific paperbacks that are floppy enough that I can read the book without cracking the spine. Do more of them exist now than did back in the 70s and 80s? But I'm not at all horrified if spine cracking happens, so I guess I'm not exactly in or out, but just in the doorway. Number 6, back to my small town, in or out? Definitely in, at least theoretically. Perhaps the assumption for most authors is that back to my small town means leaving a big city, but that doesn't have to be true. I grew up in a tiny town in North Carolina, but my family moved to my parents' hometown in South Carolina when I was in the 8th grade. I watched my mother make a somewhat difficult move back to the place where she'd grown up and which she always thought was home, but which did not always feel like home at all anymore. Thomas Wolfe's line, "You can never go home again," definitely echoed throughout my high school years. But interestingly, over the years, that town has really become home again for her. I'd love to read about how other people and characters experience that re-engagement with home after separation. Recently, I've been thinking about the, quote, reverse migration. That is, blacks living in the North moving back down to the South, where perhaps their extended families live, or where living expenses might be less expensive. Do any of you know if there is any fiction about that process of relocation? I'd love to read something like that. The next prompt, monsters are regular people, in or out? I'm not sure I'm interpreting this question in quite the way Rick intended. I suppose Frankenstein's monster is an example of a monster that nevertheless has many of the same emotions and needs of, quote, regular people. Love and comfort and safety. At least in that case, the trope definitely gets an in from me. Perhaps on the flip of this kind of story is a character like Humbert Humbert in Nabokov's Lolita. Here, instead of a monster who's actually a regular person, we have a regular person who's actually a monster. Because Nabokov asks us to see the plot through Humbert's eyes, we all have to become monsters ourselves in some way, too. Lolita is a complicated book, and I recently read a new collection of essays about its reception over time, which I do plan to talk about eventually here on BookTube. But at any rate, I suppose I am in on monsters as people, since it can, at least sometimes, allow authors to avoid the trap of making simplistic distinctions between good and evil characters. Next question. No paragraph breaks, in or out? My instinct is to say out, but I'm not sure that is always true. I still haven't read Ducks Newburyport, and I must say the lack of paragraph breaks combined with its length is the main reason I keep leaving that tome on my shelf. But I know I've been utterly intrigued with some of William Faulkner's horribly long sentences and paragraphs. So again, I'm sort of standing in the doorway on this one. Up next, in or out on multi-generational sagas? I always loved the idea of a multi-generational saga. As a Southerner by birth and as an historian by training, I'm fascinated with the ways the past contributes to the building of the present. To be honest, though, I don't always love sagas in practice. One recent novel that I had very high hopes for was Yagyasi's Homecoming, a book that I enjoyed very much at the beginning, but thought really faltered in the second half. At some point, the book started feeling like Gyasi had created new characters purely to represent moments in history, rather than to have some deep and genuine life within that history. Does that make sense? It must be very hard to create large numbers of full and complex characters and plot lines that all fit together in some larger framework. So perhaps that's why multi generational sagas can seem so uneven. In other words, I am in theoretically, but I'm often disappointed. Question 10. Rereading. In or out? Definitely in. There are some books that live in me so deeply that I read them again and again, almost as a way of meditating or doing self reflection. There are also books I reread because I know my understanding changes over time due to abstract emotional or intellectual maturity or specific experiences or whatever. The next is one I haven't actually read, Artificial Intelligence. I can understand that AI might be an interesting way of determining what humanity actually means, but I'm pretty sure it would take a lot to get me to read a book with artificial intelligence as a major theme. I suppose that means this trope is out for me. Drop caps, in or out? I love drop caps. I love the way they make the textual division in such an elegant way. Does anyone actually dislike these? I'll admit that when reading an advanced reader's copy on my e-reader, drop caps sometimes don't come through in normal ways. But that's a problem of e-readers, not of drop caps, yes? Okay, happy endings, in or out? I'm a qualified in on happy endings, although I don't prefer them to non-happy endings. Much too often, I feel like happy endings exist because authors feel they have to provide happy endings, not because they're genuine or deserved. If the happy ending comes without some kind of deep growth or revelation or believable reconciliation, I'd much rather have a sad ending. What I think I am actually in on is an ending with some sense of resolution. The plot doesn't necessarily need to be wrapped up in a bow, not at all. But I want at least the theme to come to a place of rest. Books shouldn't just stop. There needs to be some kind of shape that makes the ending seem like an ending in some way. Well, unless the author is going to use the handy waking up from a dream sequence route. The next prompt is interesting. Plot points that only converge at the end. Assuming I'm interpreting this correctly, I think this refers to the puzzle box construction where there are a variety of seemingly unrelated plot lines that suddenly come together right at the end of a book. Not just thematically, but in a plot-driven way. Perhaps we find out that two of the protagonists are really married, or one is arranging to murder the other, or whatever. I don't think I have actually read a book like this, but I have heard about them, and I think I've seen films that play off this game. That kind of construction would, I think, make me feel like the author had structured something all along just to trick me, which doesn't sound appealing, so I'll vote for out. Next, detailed magic systems. Out in general. Years ago, I loved Harry Potter, which has a relatively developed magic system, but still, the magic is only a sideline to a basic story about relationships and growth. The more specific the magic system gets, the less I would want to read a book, I think. A slightly perverse corollary, where I think I disagree with almost all other readers, the more intense the world building is in a fantasy novel or science fiction book, the less interested I am. I want to read about characters, not about settings. The setting has to support the development of the characters for me, not determine the characters. Actually, I suppose that idea is not totally divorced from my concerns about some multi-generational sagas, is it? The idea of creating characters and plots to highlight a setting rather than a setting to highlight the characters and plots. Next, classic fantasy races. This is an out for me for two reasons. First, I'm not interested in the genre of fantasy in general. And secondly, the fantasy creation of so-called races that seem to be human or human substitutes, troubles me. It often seems as if the races are completely and utterly different from each other, as if they're different species almost. Personally, I think this kind of portrayal fuels a kind of fierce identity politics, as well as hierarchy. When I see movies which other people interpret as extremely progressive, I'm sometimes bothered by a sense of some natural and preordained separation or distinction among groups of people, instead of a recognition that historical developments have, at least in the real world, created such an enormous part of what we conceive of as not just racial separation, but race as a concept. I know this is my own weird ballyhoo, so please feel free to just ignore me here. On to something else. Unreliable narrators, yay or nay? I like them, at least when they're done relatively subtly. If a character doesn't know the whole story, or tells us from a particular but limited perspective, or misunderstands something, it can be great. The technique of using an unreliable narrator allows an author to share with readers something interesting about that narrator, as well as about the character's understanding of the events of the plot. To go back to Lolita, Humbert Humbert is telling a limited version of the story, totally different from the version that Dolores would tell, for example. But his narration drives the story in a direction that would be almost impossible to achieve otherwise. If an unreliable narrator is just straight out lying to the readers, I suspect I might start feeling like it was all a trick played by the author. But, assuming they're well created, unreliable narrators are definitely in. And since I've been talking about Humbert Humbert, let's consider evil protagonists for a moment. When the main character, the one who is going through a major struggle or transformation in the main plot line of the book, turns out to be a monster, I would argue that that person is clearly a protagonist, even if we might be tempted to think of that character as an antagonist. Antagonist would be blocking that struggle or transformation or central quest, right? I suppose the factor blocking that kind of protagonist resolution could be their evil nature. Although I often feel very uncomfortable living inside the head of a deeply evil character, I honestly think that is one of the powers of great literature. So I'm in, at least at moments when I'm feeling brave. Next prompt. What do you think about the trope of the chosen one? Although I often like chosen one characters in ancient literature, I tend not to like that trope in contemporary work. I mentioned Harry Potter earlier, and while I loved the early books in the series when my family first read them, the chosen one plot was by far the least interesting part to me. In biblical literature, chosenness often means not that the character is necessarily special or especially gifted, but that the character is, for whatever reasons, charged with a specific job or responsibility. Moses was chosen despite his flaws, but the fact of his flaws is important. I'm often unsure why it matters in more modern literature that a character is a chosen one rather than a choosing one. What does the chosenness aspect add to secular stories? I'm not asking this facetiously. I really would love to hear some answers or ideas, so please chime in the comments if you have any thoughts. Next, are you in or out about the death of protagonists? I don't mind at all if it's set up well and the death is meaningful to the book rather than just for shock value or something. On the other hand, I suppose killing off your main character might be an even easier way to get out of an overly complicated plotline than waking up from a dream sequence. The next question is really long chapters, yes or no? Just like with long paragraphs or no paragraph breaks, I tend to dislike really long chapters. My reasoning might sound pretty silly. Partly, I just like stopping places where I can look up for a second, but not be tempted to stop. If chapters are really long, I'm likely not even to start the next one since I know I can't finish before whatever my next commitment might be. Yes, I do realize that I can stop reading whenever I want, and I often do, but still, long chapters sometimes make me reluctant to go on. Interestingly, right now I'm reading a book with very short chapters, and I'm thinking a lot about how that affects my reading and my understanding. Perhaps I'll talk about that issue a bit more when I talk about the book. Up next, French flaps, in or out? Let me combine this with the next one about deckled edges. Definitely in on both. I really love reading paperbacks with French flaps and deckled edges, and don't forget the drop capital. This kind of book is light enough to hold, no matter how I'm sitting or lying down, and yet they feel timeless or classic. I'm totally a sucker for that kind of commitment from publishers. Okay, signed copies by the author, in or out? I'm not a person who purchases signed collector's editions of books or who stands in line to get authors' signatures, but I have a few books signed by authors who were also friends, and those mean a lot to me. My very favorites are actually the history books my father wrote and signed for me. I also really love going through the books my father had signed by his friends and peers. In other words, it isn't about the author's signatures as much as it is about the tracing of relationships. The penultimate question, dog-earing pages, yes or no? I do occasionally dog-ear pages in books, especially in advanced readers' copies. Where I dog-ear most frequently is in newspapers and magazines. When I spot an article I really want to go back to read, but not right at that moment, or when I read something I want to take notes on later for whatever reason. Note, though, if a book has French flaps and deckled edges and drop caps, I won't mar it with dog ears, although I'm still likely to make light pencil markings in it. The last question. Chapter titles instead of numbers, in or out? I like chapter titles, although I've seen examples where the titles are either ineffective or misleading or just weird occasionally. Chapter titles and numbers are both in normally. Either one's fine with me, as long as there are chapters. Well, thanks, Rick, for putting together this excellent questionnaire. I'm eager to hear how some of the rest of you will answer these prompts. I'm afraid I've not paid close attention to who has already been tagged, but I will tag the channels Larry Has Opinions, Ms. Reads a Lot, AJ Dunn Reads and Writes, Hufflepuff Discovery, Aaron Facer, and Wild Book Garden. If I didn't tag you specifically, I would still love to see your take on the prompts. Please let me know if you've already answered them on your channel or if you're planning to, and please feel free to share some of your answers here in the comments if you prefer. Thanks all for joining me today here on Hannah's Books. See you soon.